Hi, good evening. Hi, Maeve. Hi, Lexi. Good evening to our listeners and viewers on Facebook and Zoom. My name is Petra Bölzel. I'm the director of Kunstpavillon and Neue Galerie Innsbruck, and I'm really happy to be hosting this talk tonight, an artist talk with Maeve Brennan and the curator Lexington Davis. I will just, before I give the stage or the word to them, I just would like to briefly lose some words about, or to give you a piece of context the artist talk is, about the context the artist talk is embedded in. Lexington, together with Julia De Fabo, curated the exhibition Archives of Resistance and Repair that is currently on view at Neue Galerie Innsbruck. And it presents works by Maeve Brennan, Shiraz Bachou, and Ihre. The exhibition is also where I find myself in. Behind me, you see work by Maeve Brennan, the Goods box series that Lexi and Maeve will later also take a closer look at. The exhibition is part of this year's annual program that is entitled Dancing at the Edge of the World. It is referring to the essay collection of the science fiction author Ursula Le Guin. In this book, in this essay collection, Ursula Le Guin outlines alternative realms of possibility that are not anchored in a xenophobic, patriarchal, or colonial narrative structure. That's what I really found fascinating about the book when I dived into it, and I would like to recommend again for everyone reading it and experiencing this beautiful essay collection of Ursula Le Guin. And that's how we come back to the exhibition Archives of Resistance and Repair, as this exhibition looks for ways of re-evaluating historical materials from a decolonial, anti-imperialist perspective. And it questions prevalent knowledge regimes and recounts stories that are not part of the powerful canons of history making. Having that said, I would also like to point out that Neue Galerie Innsbruck is located in the imperial palace of the House of Habsburg. So it's a quite huge and heavy building we find ourselves in. The House of Habsburg was one of the most prominent houses of Europe in the second millennium. And I guess we can all imagine who was part of their history making and who wasn't. And for me, as a director, an artistic director of this gallery, I really enjoy or always picture it as like a little kitchen that is cooking down here with art that kind of resolves the whole history in the walls of this building. So I'm really happy and thankful for the exhibition that was created by Lexington Davis and Julia De Fabo, Archives of Resistance and Repair, that is now here with these wonderful works of Maeve, Shiraz, and Ihre. So welcome, Maeve and Lexi. Where are you at the moment?
Thank you. I'm in London.
Ah, yeah. And Lexi, where are you?
I'm in Amsterdam.
Ah, okay. Before I give the word to both of you, I will also just do a brief introduction and just a brief CV so people know about your background also a little bit. And then it will all be about Maeve's artistic practice. So I start with Maeve. Maeve Brennan is an artist and filmmaker based in London. She's the current Stanley Picker Fine Art Fellow and is participating in British Art Show number 9. Solo exhibitions include Chisenhall Gallery in London, the Whitworth University of Manchester, Spike Island in Bristol, Mother's Tank Station in Dublin, Vainö Aaltonen Museum of Art in Turku in Finland, and the Kunsthaus Bregenz, which is kind of close to Neue Galerie Innsbruck and in Austria, and Outpost in Norwich. Her films have been screened internationally at festivals, including International Film Festival Rotterdam, Sheffield Dog Fest, and Film Madrid. Brennan was a fellow of the Home Workshop program by Ashkal Alwan in Beirut, and was the recipient of the Sherwood FVU Award 2018 and the Paul Hamlin Foundation Award in 2021. Yeah, we will also take a deeper look at your films throughout the talk. Then to you, Lexington Davis. Lexington Davis is a writer, curator, and art historian based between Amsterdam and Edinburgh. She's currently completing a PhD at the University of St. Andrews, funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. Her research explores feminist art from an intersectional perspective, focusing on care, labor, value, and collectivity. She has previously held curatorial and research positions at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam and the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Recently, she has organized exhibitions at the Robert Capa Contemporary Photography Center in Budapest and the Finnish Museum of Photography in Helsinki. She lectures at Leiden University, and her writing appeared in publications including Espart Art Actuel, Flash Art, and Metropolis M. She earned a BA from Bard College in New York and an MA from Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam, where she was a Fulbright Fellow. So I give the word to you, Lexi. Enjoy the talk.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and also the introduction to our exhibition. As Petra already mentioned, the exhibition currently on view, in which Maeve's work is exhibited, is Archives of Resistance and Repair. And this exhibition presents recent moving image works, moving image and installation art that explores artistic efforts to reconsider the meaning and function of historical records from a decolonial, anti-imperialist perspective. And so the exhibition is really looking at sites where personal and public histories are intersecting, exposing the fault lines between loss and recovery, entropy and rejuvenation, as well as fact and fiction. And I think this really comes out in not just in Maeve's work that is installed in the exhibition, but across her practice. And so together, the three artists are really looking at, or really trying to deconstruct powerful knowledge regimes by confronting documentary materials with new critical methodologies that foreground intimacy and embodied experience in relation to the archival materials that they engage with. Through their research-based practices, the artists remind us that the future can only be negotiated through reconciliation with our past and its lingering material remnants. So tonight, Maeve will walk us through her practice, focusing on specific works that really engage very directly with these issues. We'll start by talking about her 2015 film, Jerusalem Pink, and then we'll move on to talk about her 2017 film, The Drift, and we'll conclude with a discussion about the work that's included in the exhibition, the ongoing project, The Goods. And I think there are really a lot of very interesting overlaps between these three different works, and that together they really highlight and complicate a lot of the issues that are raised in the exhibition. So maybe we can just start by talking first a bit about your practice in general and how your work is engaging with the themes of this exhibition. So yeah, maybe I'll just start with a first question. So as you know, the exhibition is dealing primarily with the ethics of archival practices, especially in relation to histories of colonialism and imperialism, which is also a very strong concern throughout your practice. So I'm wondering, could you tell us a bit about how, just kind of a basic question, but how do archives play a role in your practice? And how do you approach working with archival materials?
Yes, thanks, Lexi. It's great to be here and lovely to be in conversation with you. Yeah, I guess just for those who don't know, I work primarily with kind of moving image work, which kind of uses a documentary approach. So I'm very kind of engaged with specific places and sites over long periods of time. And I suppose archives as such, I don't necessarily think have played a massive role in that sense, but I think I'm more interested in kind of points of encounter. And that's often kind of trying to track or document untold histories or lesser known narratives. And I think that kind of speaks to your concerns around, you know, decolonial and anti-imperial kind of narratives. And that has kind of manifested through a particular focus in the Middle East, where I lived for 3 years in Beirut and spent long periods of time in Jerusalem and the West Bank, and has kind of found its way into my films through engagements with, as Ariella Azule, who I think we'll speak about later, terms, living worlds. So I guess kind of places that exist and have stories that need to be told, but maybe due to kind of more dominant narratives and ideologies are less well known. So I feel like that's kind of where my efforts have been in my practice, and in terms of how that manifests, they become kind of documentary films that include interviews with characters that I engage with over these long periods of time and try to build kind of intimate and close relationships, so that I suppose kind of you get to a deeper state of subject matter and can tell different stories. And I guess also because there's always been an interest in sort of history and different kinds of time spans, this inevitably kind of leads me to documents. So through each kind of body of research, I end up engaging with forms of archive or document in different places. And that can be kind of personal history, as it was with Jerusalem Pink, and coming across a book of my great-grandfather that I'll go into detail on later, or this current project, which kind of is my most sort of archive heavy, and the archive in this work is very much a kind of living, breathing archive that's being added to constantly, and by its very nature and its involvement within a kind of underground economy of looted and stolen artifacts, basically tells an anti-imperial, anti-colonial story. So yeah, I think that's kind of a good starting point for how I'm engaging with archives.
Yeah, that's really great. Also, just a great introduction to your practice as a whole, which I think you cover a lot of the issues you introduce a lot of the issues that we're going to discuss. So maybe it makes the most sense if we just move into talking about these three works. So I know the first work we're going to discuss is Jerusalem Pink. So maybe we can just share some images from the film.
Sure. Yeah, I'm just going to share my screen. So I think we were going to begin by me briefly introducing Jerusalem Pink, which is, yeah, as Lexi mentioned, a film I made in 2015. The film's starting point was basically, I discovered a kind of architectural survey that my great-grandfather had produced, which was a large book that was published in 1924. And my great-grandfather, Ernest Richmond, was based in Jerusalem from 1917 to 37 during the British Mandate in Palestine. And so this was already a kind of direct sort of connection to this incredibly contested site. And the survey was of the Dome of the Rock, which is this very famous octagonal shrine in the old city of Jerusalem, which still kind of finds itself at the center of the Israel-Palestine conflict. And the book itself was absolutely extraordinary. This is a diagram that he drew of the different layers of the building. And the book goes into detail about the kind of state of the building, its disrepair, and what would be needed to do to restore it. And there was also a kind of very kind of arresting poetic statement that he'd written in the introduction to the book, which basically said, the Dome of the Rock is alive, almost in the same sense that a man is alive. It changes its tissues and renews its structure in order to maintain power to enshrine the soul that is in it. So he kind of likens the building to a human body, and these kinds of acts of maintenance and repair that had kept the building standing over 14 centuries. He kind of saw that as almost a political act. And I think that was kind of also very interesting in relation to the state of Israel, kind of often talking about the Temple of Solomon being in the same site, and this kind of basically the power of the presence of the survival of that building in relation to the Palestinian cause. And so I was very interested in that, and also this fairly quotidian sort of acts of fixing up and repairing becoming this very politically sort of important act. And that began a sort of interest that has persisted through projects since in The Drift and in my current project, which we'll get to later. And so the film is kind of made up of interviews with 4 different Palestinian men working with stone in various ways. I had kind of read a chapter in a book by A.L. Weisman, who is head of research architecture at Goldsmiths and had published his PhD around that time called Hollow Land, which basically talks about the way that Israel uses architecture to kind of maintain its occupation. And he was talking about Jerusalem stone cladding in the old city of Jerusalem. And basically that during the time that my great-grandfather was there was a bylaw put in place that buildings had to be clad with Jerusalem stone. And the Israeli kind of civil plan of 1967 instated this more strongly and coated all of the settlements extensions of Jerusalem with the same stone. So the stone itself became a kind of agent of politics and kind of distilled larger political, social, and historical forces. So I was very interested in stone already at that time, and I'd worked with geologists, and maybe we'll talk about my interest in geology kind of more broadly as we go through. But this was a very particular case, of course, and I was tied to it through this kind of family history. And so when I finally went to Palestine, I interviewed a geologist, an archaeologist. This is the archaeologist at the geologist's house. And I interviewed a stone worker and also an architect who had been the resident architect at the Dome of the Rock and was familiar with my great-grandfather's book. So the film was very kind of personal journey for me. And I think that's often the way that I move through my films. It's kind of an exploration, and I'm led by encounters, and those encounters sort of start to form the work. And I think that's the kind of closest way that I can kind of attend to the reality that I'm experiencing. And I feel like that's the sort of intimacy and proximity that I was speaking about earlier in terms of trying to, really get to know the people that I'm working with and trying to represent them in a way that seems apt to their stories and what they're trying to say. So I'll stop sharing and then maybe we can talk in a bit more detail about it.
Yeah, thank you so much for that introduction to the film. And I think this is something that recurs throughout your work, this close collaboration with specialists and specialists who work very closely with materials. And this can really range, from, as you mentioned, geologists, scientists, to also car mechanics. And so it's very different relationship to materials and also to their history and their use value. So I'm really curious how you initiate these relationships and how they inform the process of your work and the work itself.
Yeah, it's kind of, I suppose it's at the core of my entire practice, is that I'm sort of interested in people that have these material practices, and yeah, as you said, ranging from sort of car mechanics all the way to experts in bats. So it's a very wide-ranging sort of interest, but it's always people that have a kind of a material expertise of some kind. So there's a way of sort of understanding or navigating the world through a sort of tactile starting point. And I think that kind of began with geology and an interest specifically in how stone kind of condensed or physicalized time, and kind of through discussions with geologists sort of coming to be sort of handed pieces of stone and being told that they were sort of 2,000 million years old, or, you know, and this kind of confronting something that was in a kind of theoretical sense completely impossible to grasp, but at the same time having this sort of physical object in front of me that was supposedly a kind of material manifestation of that idea of temporality. And the same kind of applies to lots of other elements. So with archaeologists, like the archaeologist in Jerusalem, Pink, he was also talking about different kinds of pottery across the Palestinian landscape and how using those, he could basically figure out where he was in Palestine if he had kind of just been handed a piece of pottery. So that it's a kind of, I suppose, a sort of embodied knowledge, to use the term that you used in the introduction, which I've always just been drawn to. And I think, you know, the same can be said for someone that's an expert in car mechanics, as we'll discover with Mohammed. I think it's that kind of understanding of the world that is so innate, that I feel particularly connected with. And it just, yeah, it's recurred throughout all of these projects. So we'll see it and we can discuss it in detail.
Yeah, and I think there's also, especially in these two films, in Jerusalem Pink and in The Drift, this real, the importance of place is really strong. Most of your work you make in the Middle East, and your most recent work in the exhibition deals with objects that were looted from southern Italy. And so there's this a real strong connection to like the Mediterranean region. And I think in your films, it also comes out really strongly in the shots you take of, very wide shots of the desert, and very beautiful, beautiful shots. They have a very, very kind of photographic quality to them. And so it really becomes very integral to the story you're telling. And so I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that connection, like what your connection is to this region, and how it plays a role in what like the message of your work is.
Yeah, I mean, it was initially this kind of exploration of the personal family history in Palestine that took me out to the Middle East. And then following that, I stayed, I moved to Beirut, and I lived there for 3 years. And that was, kind of still connected to Palestine, but it was also just me kind of finding my way through that place, which was very complicated. And it was only after being there for a number of years that I felt able to make The Drift, because this is something I feel quite strongly about, just in the sense of the kind of stories I want to tell. I think there's a kind of responsibility to try and grasp the place that you're speaking about in a deep way. So that's kind of at the kind of core of my approach to these films. In terms of the way the landscape appears, I think, yeah, it's a nice point that you make. And there is often this shift between kind of an individual and individual practices, most likely of some kind of form of repair or maintenance or kind of a material practice, and then this kind of zoom out into the landscape. And I think often the landscape kind of also plays a character in the films. And I think in The Drift, which we'll come to, all of the stories are kind of taking place in this particular part of Lebanon, the eastern side, which borders Syria, and you're kind of being told about these different layers of history that are present inside that landscape and the different civilizations that have existed there. And so the landscape is sort of like the canvas that all of these different kinds of moments in time have occurred on, you know, and that's just human history. I often also draw on kind of geological history, so geological time, which is manifested materially in the landscape. So, you know, earthquakes, or, you know, in Jerusalem Pink, we talk about the formation of Jerusalem stone millions of years ago. And it's that landscape that these sort of geopolitical narratives are playing out on now. So I guess I'm trying to often contextualize the human moment in relation to these kind of longer durations, to put things in context. And yeah, I think that's kind of how I'm thinking about landscape.
Yeah, thank you. That's really, really interesting. Maybe we could talk about The Drift, because I think a lot of the discussion kind of draws on both films.
Yeah, should I pull up the...
Yeah, maybe you could give just like a brief introduction to the work. And then I believe we have a trailer of it.
Oh yeah, of course.
If we're showing that.
Yeah, I'll do the introduction with some images. So The Drift was a film I made in 2017, and it kind of plots the stories of three different men. One is an archaeological restorer who is based at the American University of Beirut, whose hands you see here. And he was one of the first people I met when I moved to Beirut through a friend who was an archaeologist. And he was based out of a basement office at the university, and was responsible for piecing together these clay artifacts that had been excavated during the mass excavations that happened in downtown Beirut after the civil war ended. And he'd been doing this work for the past 25 years, very quietly, without any formal training. He had taught himself how to do it. And it was a very kind of amazing encounter, because he showed me his back office, which was filled with all of these reconstructed pots with holes in. And the kind of, the nature of this work was that it was endless, and it kind of had this sort of very poetic quality, and Hashem was also wonderful. So he was kind of the starting point for the film. I was already kind of thinking about practices of repair from Jerusalem Pink, and obviously in the context of Lebanon and the Civil War, this kind of work took on a different sort of resonance. And at the same time, I was very interested in the youth culture, which I'd encountered through various kinds of encounters with joyriders, basically in the city and also outside of the city, doing kind of tricks in their cars. And there's a big kind of culture of rebuilding and reconstructing cars from different parts. And in the Bekaa Valley, in the eastern flank where the drift is set, there's fields and fields of scrapyards filled with cars like this. And I was kind of interested in thinking about the car as a sort of contemporary kind of related object. So, but in all of its contemporariness. So the fact that it's traded, and it's come so often there with these BMWs that have come from the West and were being reused in Lebanon and sold for parts. And I was kind of interested in finding someone who kind of could work with the BMWs in the same way that Hashem was working with the pots. So someone that could kind of take them apart and piece them back together, to draw this parallel between these kinds of two kinds of material culture. Then I met Fakhri, and he was a Roman temple guardian, who was based also in the eastern side of Lebanon. I had been told by a friend that there were a string of Roman temples lining the eastern side of Lebanon, which borders Syria. And at the time, it was the war in Syria, and recently there had been the kind of destruction at Palmyra and the murder of the guardian of the temples there. And there was the kind of fear in Lebanon that ISIS would cross the border, and obviously these historic sites were right on the border. So I was interested to go and see them, basically, and then each one had a guardian. And Fakhri had been responsible for 2 sites in Niha, and he had been guarding them for 43 years, day and night. And you get this idea from him in the film that he is incredibly kind of strongly linked to that site. He says that the temples run in his blood, and there's this real sort of profound locatedness and connectedness to the Romans. And he talks about how the village is also made from the stones of the temple. So there's this kind of use and living with these historical sites in a way that kind of felt really exciting to see, you know, as an alternative to the sort of the museum model of kind of removing objects from their context and putting them in white rooms, which I'm sure we'll get to. Yeah, The Drift kind of plots these three different characters, and their stories sort of intertwine across this landscape. And that's The Drift. So maybe we'll show the clip. Paul, if you have it.
ايه مصمصة عامة عم تشيل ياخذ سيجارة يولع عليها بالكاميرا ولا بالتاع لا تعرفي كل حجر وين محل له الحجار إلا لا يكون هو مشتغل بإيده يعني.
هيدا دارج هالفترة؟
إنه هذا خرج سيارات سباق. بكرة بنعملها طيارة للسيارة.
Hopefully it gave a sort of impression of the film, although it's hard to, it's a bit hard to show it in this type of format. But I think, you know, one thing that comes up in The Drift, and I think comes up in throughout your work, is there's this kind of tension between the desire to preserve and maintain and, you know, keep an object or a site in a certain, you know, to keep them safe. But at the same time, there's, on the other hand, there's this desire to, you know, take apart or reuse objects. Like the example, you give the example of the temple and how people from the village would take stones from the temple, and the temple guardian talks about this, and they would use these stones to build their houses. And then there's another part in the film where Mohammed, the mechanic, talks about really wanting to take tires from a BMW that belongs to a someone who was a member of Hezbollah and got assassinated. So his car is just, you know, sitting there, but it has these perfect tires. So there's this kind of tension between, you know, the impulse to preserve something versus the desire to use it in a different way. And so I'm curious if you could talk a bit about this, since it repeats throughout your works.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, and I think it's I was just trying to think about my position in relation to it as you were asking the question. I suppose it's kind of, there is a kind of reverence given to historical objects in sort of Western culture, which I think in a sense can almost be to the detriment of the objects themselves. So like a state of preservation that is about actually extracting an object from its living world or context and, you know, keeping it safe, even if that's keeping it in a storeroom in the basement of a museum that has far too many objects already to have on display at once, not naming any names, but, you know, this is the state of things in our kind of post-colonial world. And I suppose what I was kind of taken with when I was encountering these historical sites in both Palestine and Lebanon was a sort of intimacy and contact between the people that lived with and amongst those sites, and a kind of an ability to sort of exist with them in the same time and not kind of push them into this sort of state of a historical site. So there's another character that appears in The Drift who's a collector of objects, and he took me on a tour of his garden, and he had kind of Roman sarcophagi that he had found used as kind of plant pots, and and a real sort of a kind of different relationship to these objects that, you know, at the time I was quite shocked to see that, but there's another kind of part of me that was just really kind of glad that those objects were still where they were from and were with people that cared about them in a very particular way. So I think I guess that was kind of a big paradigm shift for me. And what was really interesting was also in the film, we meet a smuggler who was involved in smuggling artifacts from Syria, that a huge trade kind of grew after the war started, and objects were coming in over the mountains in the east of Lebanon. And I also began to hear about subsistence looting. So there's so much kind of material culture in Lebanon that, you know, you can pretty much dig somewhere in a hillside and you might find something. And Mohammed, the young car mechanic, had told me stories of his friends making thousands of pounds doing that. But what became clear was that these objects are only being kind of damaged and dug up and looted because there's a market for them. And in the film, the collector says, I ask him, where do they go? And he says, oh, mostly museums in London. And so that was also a very interesting turning point for me. And I guess that's what led to this current project, because once you start to think about it, that there's a market and a kind of demand in predominantly the West, but also in Japan and Australia and other kind of countries, that is what's kind of sustaining this market, and you know, in the end is kind of damaging material culture elsewhere. So I suppose those who might say that they're the countries that are kind of preserving and saving material culture are actually at fault in kind of promoting looting of these sites. So yeah, I guess that's kind of a way of framing things differently.
Yeah, and I think another interesting point is that these two films are made in sites of conflict, and I know that also informs the way you approach not just the subject matter, but also the materials that are, you know, the heart of your investigations. So I don't know if you could speak a bit more about this.
Yeah, I suppose, although that's kind of present in the works, I never really address that directly, because I feel like those stories about Palestine and Lebanon are kind of well trodden, and I suppose there's inflections of that, and there's the presence of that kind of geopolitical context. So, you know, in Jerusalem Pink, basically, you know, they're also talking about the limitations of the stone economy and what's possible and the present, and the way that kind of people can function in their day-to-day lives. But what I was more interested in actually representing was a kind of material expertise that these Palestinian men have, and a kind of very, very in-depth knowledge to that landscape, and the same on this kind of I was interested in documenting these acts of care and maintenance carried out by men in this landscape that, you know, is mostly sort of created with the Civil War and the more recent conflict. And so for The Drift, I kind of often think of it as different instances of masculinity and care. So I kind of, although there, of course, is the presence of conflict in that landscape, and one of the sites that Fakhri takes us to in the film is called Hassan-Niha, and it's a temple on the hillside above the site that you saw him in there. And it's completely broken. And I assumed that it was a historical damage done by the earthquakes that he'd discussed with me previously, but he said actually it was Syrian warplanes that had dropped a bomb there during the Civil War. So that was very interesting that, of course, conflict has an impact on these historical sites too. And that kind of fortress had been used as a fort in the Civil War. So which was also very interesting. But yeah, I'd say that in terms of conflict, it's kind of forming a sort of backdrop to what I would hope are more sort of intimate stories that are being told of how people just live day to day.
Mm-hmm. So maybe we could now just move to the talking about the work that's in the exhibition, which I think also there's a lot of overlaps between this work and what we've already discussed as well. So yeah, I think maybe we can share some of the, for anyone who hasn't been to the exhibition, we can share some installation shots, and there's also some photographs in.
Here we are.
Yeah.
Yeah. Should I introduce? Yeah. So my part of this exhibition comes from a body of work called The Goods, which grew out of my research for The Drift and this kind of interest in the Western demand for artifacts and that kind of economy and how it was functioning. And I was looking out for stories that related to this kind of economy. And I came across a news story, I guess it was in 2017, where a forensic archaeologist called Dr. Christos Tsirogiannis was quoted as he'd basically identified 2 Greek vases at Frieze Masters as being connected to an illicit antiquities dealer called Gianfranco Becchina, and had asked for the vases to be removed from sale and repatriated to Greece. And this is just one instance of the kind of work that he does. He basically scans auction catalogs and museum collections and all kinds of places where artifacts can be found, and compares them to a large digital archive that he has put together from confiscated records of convicted antiquities dealers. So this is a giant archive with images of over 100,000 objects. And so far he's identified over 1,000 illicit objects at Christie's, Sotheby's, the Met, the British Museum, all kinds of major institutions. And so I reached out to Christos, and we've kind of been collaborating on this project called The Goods ever since. And the body of work is basically an attempt to give form to what is otherwise a very underground, invisible economy that basically goes unnoticed because it involves some of the most powerful institutions and people in the world who, in a sense, can operate above the law. And it's this specific work in Archives of Resistance and Repair grew out of a very particular case that Christos is working on, where a warehouse in the Geneva Freeport was raided in 2014, and the warehouse belonged to a convicted antiquities dealer called Robin Symes, who was based in London, and he was very much the kind of toast of London at some stage. Everyone had bought objects from him, but he's now disgraced as it became very clear that he was operating as part of this illegal network and was supplied by numerous convicted dealers. And when they did this raid, they found numerous crates containing hundreds of thousands of artifacts worth millions of pounds. And Christos and the director of the Antiquities Museum in Aarhus in Denmark managed to source 3 of these crates for forensic study. And they contained boxes filled with Apulian artifacts, hand-painted fragments which you can see on these screens here. These boxes had Polaroids attached to them, and we've got some images of these. So these Polaroids were found attached to the boxes and basically displayed the contents of each box. But Polaroids are particularly interesting in the history of the illicit antiquities market because Polaroids offered up a kind of instant form of documentation, which was also unique. And so basically it proved to whoever you're trying to sell the object to that you had been with that object. And this is something I found very interesting engaging with these kind of archives, is how certain technological advancements in photography facilitated different parts of this economy. And so the piece in the show is actually an algorithm that I developed with a programmer, which is basically set to permanently search the contents of these images. And I was interested in that kind of idea that they would just be looking forever for clues within these very extraordinary images that do contain evidence that has contributed to Christos's kind of analysis and forensic investigation on the ways that this network works. So different kinds of materials, kind of poor restoration that you can see. There's always these hands kind of severed from bodies, so you never get a subject. And yeah, I think I'll stop there for now.
So yeah, one thing I think is really fascinating about this project that differs from the other 2 artworks and the other artists in the show and their artworks is you're dealing with archives that were never meant to be seen publicly, that were meant for private use, whereas the other 2 artists are dealing with public archives that were always meant to be researched and shared. So I think it raises really interesting questions about what is unseen and what is invisible, and what does making this collection of materials and this and everything that comes with it, the documentation, the photography, what does the act of making this visible mean, especially when thinking about this body of material as a kind of archive. It's more of an observation than a question, but I just think it's something, very interesting that your work brings up.
Yeah, I know it. I mean, it is interesting, and I think it is that kind of the possibility for what we can learn from those images, and I suppose that's kind of foregrounded in Christos's work as a forensic archaeologist. So he's somewhere between a kind of a police detective and an archaeologist. And I find those 2 roles very interesting and kind of interconnected in the sense that you are sort of sifting through material, trying to glean clues. And there is a real beautiful parallel in those methodologies. And it's something that I've started to kind of unpack in a new film work, which I'm currently editing, and I shot with Christos and Vinny in Aarhus last summer. So part of the process that they're going through is to unpack all of the materials, taking note of every single kind of packaging material, any notes, any tape with details on, any Polaroid images, any newspapers that have dates to show when those objects were packed, or maybe even locate the objects and where they were packed. So we found English newspapers dated from between 1987 and 1990. So this is the kind of forensic process. And then on top of that, they're starting to piece together the fragments. So there's this kind of archaeological puzzling that's taking place where they're starting to piece together the vases to see how complete they are. Usually as a kind of result of looting, these objects are always incomplete because it's done in a frantic hurry in the middle of the night without any archaeological kind of care or consideration for what will be lost in that process. And so there's this kind of layering of these two kinds of puzzling going on. And through those two kind of models of thinking, trying to build an image of this case, but then also an image of what these vases were to that historical moment, and trying to kind of, basically get back some of this lost historical narrative that is destroyed in that moment of looting. So it's wonderful, you know, they're kind of shifting between talking about this forensic evidence and then also starting to talk about the mythological scenes that they're piecing together on the vases. That's going to become a film which is called An Excavation, and will be the culmination of my fellowship at Stanley Picker Gallery at Kingston University in May. So,
and this is a continuation, it's part of this larger project, is that correct?
Yeah.
And so where do you expect, I know this project is ongoing, so where do you expect to take it from here? You have the film, but are you planning to engage with this material beyond that, beyond making the film?
So I mean, it's because it's connected to this actual sort of reality. It's constantly shifting and developing, and kind of new sort of revelations are happening. Christos is constantly making identifications at different museums, which is building a kind of more detailed image of the network piece by piece. And one element of our collaboration is that we're producing an archive, so a kind of a database which will kind of comprise of all of Christos's identifications. So each case, each object, and through each case, all the kind of known roles, people involved will be kind of added into this mapping system. And we'll be starting to build a kind of visual map of all the different people involved, institutions, auction houses, etc. So there will be a kind of, it will be made visual in a way that it hasn't been before. And I think that's one of the things that is so difficult with this subject, is it's so complex and there's so many different kinds of roles involved that it's very hard to grasp the kind of the scale of this economy, and how many kind of major institutions are involved and to what degree. And so that was why I was interested in kind of pulling it into a visual realm through this kind of digital form. So that will be something that's ongoing and added to as Christos continues with his work. And I think it will be a really great legacy for the project, and a kind of open access resource for academics or whoever is interested. And yes, I will continue the collaboration with Christos, and I hope to make many more films. You know, there's endless kind of amazing stories, and I see it as a kind of lifelong collaboration.
Maybe now, I don't know, Petra, if we should open up to questions. If you have any questions, Petra, or if anyone else does. Are
there any questions from the people on Zoom or on Facebook?
I found a question in from an attendee that says, could Maeve talk a little bit more about the idea of who has the right to commodify the past features in her work?
I guess I think that's kind of what I was trying to get at with where the demand for historical objects lies. You know, it seems to be something that's happening, you know, historically in England. London specifically has a huge market for antiquities, and so does New York, but that's kind of spread a little bit wider since globalization kind of took hold. But I think it's quite clear that you can see that there are objects from source countries, as Ariella Azulay would call it, that go to other, you know, richer nations. And that's also the way that she would see these kinds of forms of extraction in terms of producing documents and, you know, historical archives. And there are these source countries where we have plundered objects, images, and taken them to these kind of richer countries that feel they have the imperial right to do so. And this still kind of exists in various forms. You can see it through a sort of Israeli appropriation of many Palestinian kinds of cultures, food, embroidered tobes. You know, this is something that happens through that imperial power dynamic again and again. And I think that's kind of where you see these objects ending up. And those are the people that I think seem to feel they have the right to commodify the past. If that's what the question means.
You said at a point that you're going to talk more about your interest in geology.
Oh.
And I don't know if I missed it or if you did go deeper into it, but that would be something I would be interested in.
Yeah, no, that's I guess it was one of the earliest sort of documentary projects that I ever kind of engaged with, which was actually during my studies at Goldsmiths. I was looking at these black stone beaches in Dorset, and it turned out that they were made of oil shale. And I ended up kind of contacting the British Geological Association, and that led me to meet with a geologist called Vic Coulter, who had been basically involved in this massive discovery of a giant oil field in Dorset, which is on the south coast of England. And it's the only discovery of that scale in terms of oil that's ever happened in the UK. And it was just extraordinary meeting him, and his kind of, I guess, his embroilment with these very kind of intense political subjects, but coming at it from this very just materially interested kind of methodology, and looking at the stone and thinking about the way that it had moved over these vast time spans. And he was the one that actually showed me this core sample that he'd dug up when he discovered the oil. And he said, this is 2000 million years old. And this was the moment where I kind of held this time in my hands and felt this kind of, intense sort of strange, I guess, material manifestation of like an ungraspable concept in my hands. So I think that was the starting point. And I guess I've always been interested in the way that geology sort of brushes up against all of these incredibly sort of politicized subjects, like oil exploration, and also more currently in terms of the Anthropocene and the fact that humans have become the dominant geological force, and we're kind of having to come to terms with thinking about these giant timescales and slow moving disasters that have taken shape and are now kind of manifesting in the climate crisis. And that kind of came through in a film I made called Listening in the Dark, which we didn't go into today. But I was kind of looking at geological time.
Listening to the dark, the movies, what's the title of the movie again? Can you
Listening in the Dark.
Listening in the Dark.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of, I suppose, been my interest in geology. But it's funny that it's become so sort of foregrounded and central in terms of discussions around the climate crisis. And I remember I saw a talk by Bruno Latour when I was living in Beirut, and he was saying that he had been in this kind of conference of geologists, and they were all being asked to name the new epoch, the new geological epoch, and they couldn't, because they were so used to working incredibly slowly and on these kinds of time periods that were of this such colossal scale. And suddenly they were at the front and center of this kind of political time, which was, so fast, and they couldn't make the decision. And I think I'm very interested in that kind of the speed of the day-to-day and politics and geopolitical kind of time in relation to this thinking about a kind of vaster context. That's kind of where I'm coming from.
Thank you. And I mean, you keep on working on the goods, the project of the goods. You already talked about it, but is there also another project that you're currently working on, or you don't want to talk about it?
I've really been focusing on this. So yeah, there's potentially another film that will be developing out of this body of work. And yeah, we'll see what happens. But yeah, no, I've been totally in the midst of editing this new film, which is an excavation, which is part of this research. And yeah, haven't had time to think about anything else.
Lexi, do you have another question, or Lexi's still here?
Yeah. Yes, I'm here. I mean, I have a lot more questions, so you just have to tell me when I have to stop. I think you've already mentioned a few times, but you haven't gone into in a lot of detail, is your engagement with Ariella Azoulay, who, and especially I believe her recent book, Unlearning Imperialism, or potential history, Unlearning Imperialism. And so I'm just curious, you know, how her work has influenced your own work. You've already mentioned a few different ways, but if you could talk a little bit more about that, and about you know, at what point in your process you started engaging with her ideas, if it was just this book, or if the engagement is goes further back.
Yeah, no, it does. I came across her when I was on my undergraduate studies, and her book, The Civil Contract of Photography, came out whilst I was studying. And I suppose her interest in photographic practice and the kind of power dynamic that's in place in that moment of documentation has always kind of shaped my thinking as someone who's working with documentary film. And it's something I'm always negotiating in those encounters and thinking through how I'm kind of operating in that moment and how I want to do it differently to perhaps, you know, more dominant mainstream forms of media and kind of quicker modes of production that maybe glean sort of simple or oversimplified narratives. I suppose I'm always interested in trying to generate kind of complexity and nuance in those forms of representation. But yeah, when Potential History came out, it was just so timely in relation to this project, because it was very specifically talking about, you know, repatriation of objects and just those kinds of discussions around decolonization of museums, all kinds of things that I'd been thinking through anyway in relation to this work. And I suppose I was really enjoying in that book her discussion of different ways of telling stories or gathering stories or histories, and she describes there's a quote where she says, a mode of being with others differently. So instead of sort of going in with this sort of extractive mindset, instead kind of existing with your subjects closely and being intertwined. And I think there's another quote, which is, the more you're required to prove your expertise, the more distant you have to be from your subject matter, or something along those lines. And I suppose I'd always been advocating for this kind of proximity to what I was trying to engage with. And so she was really sort of speaking to, I suppose, different strategies that I'd been deploying in my practice, but without maybe really observing them with that kind of academic distance. And there were all kinds of examples of this that had kind of occurred through my research. So, for instance, Fakhri, who you meet in The Drift, he talked a lot about French colonial experts coming to this temple and describing things inaccurately because they were kind of coming at it from this very distanced perspective, whereas Fakhri had actually been involved and led the restoration of this temple, had embodied the building techniques of the Romans in order to do so, and understood exactly how they'd had to move these kind of colossal stones. So, you know, this was a really beautiful moment where his expertise was something that he knew he could only know through having done that with his hands. And I think there's something about that sort of embodied understanding of material objects that sort of outdid the academic distance that the French archaeologists had kind of swanned into this site and kind of spoken about. So it's just been a really, really kind of revelatory book. I actually got to ask her questions in a talk for RCA for a public lecture, and she was completely wonderful, and I highly recommend this book. I think it's really, really urgent and important.
Thank you, Lexi and Maeve, for the talk, and also Julia, she's also in the chat, Julia and Lexi, for curating the show, which is now still on until March. We extended it. And yeah, so pass by, see it, and we hope to get a chance to, Maeve, to see you hopefully in Innsbruck one day in person. And yeah, we will carry on the talk probably with other artists from the show in the next near future.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thanks, Lexi.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Have a lovely evening.
You too.
Soon.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Ciao.
Bye.